Well, welcome to the study of Daniel chapter 6. You know, there are a lot of great stories in the Bible, a lot of memorable stories, a lot of things you think of that maybe you learned as children. And one of those is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And that's what we come to in Daniel chapter 6. Now, as we've said, the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are for the most part stories. When we move into the next chapter, chapter 7, and the rest of the book, those are more prophetic visions and sayings. And so the book of Daniel is going to get a little more difficult after this chapter, but we're still in a narrative section, and so a great story in the Bible. You know, one of the interesting things about the stories in the Bible is that they are revelatory stories. They're interesting, they're great, but you know, there are lots of interesting stories in the world and in our lives, but these are particularly revelatory. They were revelatory moments in which God revealed himself, and so they're special stories of God's revelation of himself and his nature and his will, but they're also written in ways that they are particularly revelatory for us, and which is partly why there's just so much depth in all of the Bible. You read these stories and you can simply never exhaust them, and that's certainly true in this story of Daniel and the lion's den. Now, here's a story that you say on first thought, well, you know, this is very familiar. I know what this story is. It's you know, a story of Daniel's faith and God's rescue of him, and that's certainly true. But here's a story that has a lot of angles and nuances and lots of things to talk about in it that certainly as I studied it, I found it very surprising. So here's how Daniel chapter 6 begins. It says, it pleased Darius. Now, Darius is one of the kings of the the Medes and the Persians empire, and they would follow the Babylonians. And so it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. These were officials to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the entire kingdom. Well, so one of the interesting things about this story is that Daniel's at the end of his life here. It's speculated that he may be in his 80s at this point. Daniel has a very long career. He starts as a young man in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, but at this point he's old. He's got a lot of years under his belt. He's also got a lot of wisdom, and but he is still working. He is a servant of the king. So the picture of Darius here is the picture of somebody who's a good administrator. In any kingdom, you have to administer the kingdom, and so he set up some levels of administration. He has the satraps, and over them he has got 3 counselors. Daniel is one of those. So if you think about what it takes to be a good ruler, well, it takes some ability in management and administration, and we see that Darius here as the king, he is taking thought for the management of his kingdom. And if you think about it, every leader needs good advisors. The President of the United States always has a cabinet and advisors, and you always want to put good people in these positions so that you will get good advice. Well, one of the things we're going to see in this passage is that Daniel is particularly gifted in administration. There are a few places in the Bible where we see people who have the gift of administration. Paul certainly mentions that in the New Testament as one of the gifts of the Spirit, and we might think particularly of Joseph in the Old Testament at the end of the book of Genesis. He's somebody who particularly is gifted at administration, and everything he touches works well, and God blesses. And Daniel seems to be like that. He really does seem to have a gift for administration. Now, so what we're going to discover here is that the other members of the administration are they're jealous of Daniel. They have a grudge against him, and they are going to try to work for his demise. So I'm not going to read the next section, but what happens is the satraps get together and all the administrators, and we assume everybody practically but Daniel, and they go to the king and they say, "Oh, king, we've got a great idea. We think that for 30 days you should make a law that no one should," and let's see exactly how this is worded, that no one should make a petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, and if they do, they will be cast into a den of lions. So, so kind of what's going on here? Well, the other bureaucrats, well, they're jealous of Daniel. There might be some racial jealousy here. After all, he's a Hebrew, and they are Persians. So they may not like this interloper having authority over them. One of the realities may be that this is a bit of a corrupt group, and Daniel's not. So if Daniel is in charge, he's going to watch over them and not allow them to do some of the things for their own benefit that they may in fact want to do. And so here we have a picture of the bureaucracy of the Persian kingdom about 2,500 years ago. And a couple of things we see. First, there is a bureaucracy. And secondly, that bureaucracy is not always above board. So here's a corrupt bureaucracy. We've talked about that a lot at times in the political world, and the word used is the swamp, which is certainly a pejorative and negative term to talk about a bureaucracy that gets in place and begins to have a primary motive, which is to maintain their position and their power and their authority, and works toward that end more than necessarily the good ends of the country. So we see that at work here, and so they present this idea to the king, and the king agrees to it. And we might ask, this seems to be a silly thing, that everyone must ask their petitions of the king instead of anyone else, another person or God. And so why would Darius, who otherwise appears to be a very wise ruler, why would he agree to such a thing? Well, it certainly might have been a stroking of his pride. He might have it made him felt good. He thought, oh yes, here's a great idea, and so it might have stroked his pride and made him feel a little godlike. The rulers say everybody has agreed, and he thinks, well, if they all think it's a good idea, then maybe it is. Of course, everyone hasn't agreed. In particular, Daniel had not agreed. So the next thing that happens is the law is decreed, the law according to the Medes and Persians, which, as it says here, cannot be changed. So the administrators have laid a trap for Daniel. Now it says, verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So Daniel knows exactly what's going on. This is a trap. This law is aimed at him. But Daniel has a practice, and it's interesting to note, Daniel has a regular rhythm to his life with God, his devotional life, which is that he opens his window, I suppose when the weather's good, a window that faces toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he gets down on his knees and he talks with God. Now, why would he face Jerusalem? Well, interestingly, in Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, God, he asked God and says, "Oh God, when people pray, when they turn toward this place, when they face this place," meaning Jerusalem and the temple, "and pray, oh God, answer their prayers." So that's exactly what Daniel is doing. He is turning to face Jerusalem as Solomon has said, and he is making his prayer and petition to God. Now, so again, we see a little bit of the pattern of Daniel to pray, his regular pattern. And it reminds us to ask the question, well, do we have some patterns? Do we have a rhythm to our life with God? Does it have some structure? And here we see that Daniel's life certainly does. Now, so what happens at this point is the men come and they find Daniel, who's actually doing what they knew he would be doing, which is making his petition to God. So they go as a group, they go to the king and they say, "Oh, king, well, remember this law you made?" And he says, "Yes, that's a great law. I just thought that was an excellent idea." And then the administrators spring the trap. They say, "Well, this Daniel, this interloper, this Hebrew that you've been in charge of so many things, well, he doesn't pay any attention to you, O king, because he's disobeying your law." Now, we might think of the story of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego before the great image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And that's what the people came to and said to Nebuchadnezzar, "These three Hebrews, they don't pay attention to you, O king. They are defying your authority." Well, it's at this point that the king realizes he's been duped. This is a trap for Daniel, whom Darius at this point trusts. He trusts him. Maybe he thinks, "I finally found an honest man in government," and he is intending to put him in charge of the realm so that, as it says, he suffers no loss, there's no corruption, and all these folks are not trying to cheat the king when he's not looking. And so the king realizes that he's been played. So it says that he tries to free Daniel in some way, and yet the administrators come to him and say, "O king, this law cannot be changed. It's the law of the Medes and the Persians," and so the king has no other route, no other choice except to follow through. Now we have a little interaction with the king, with Daniel, for whom the king seems to have great affection. And so he brings him to the den of lions, and the king declares to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve continually deliver you." So even the king recognizes that Daniel serves God continually. He is faithful. He is a person who is devout and consistent in his integrity, his honesty, and his devotion. And so it says that they sealed the lion's den, and the king sealed it with his own signet. So they seal it with wax and the king's signet, so that no one's going to break in. The king can't get in to rescue Daniel, but the administrators can't get in to kill him either themselves. And so the king is saying to Daniel, "Oh, Daniel, may your God deliver you." And it's interesting that is somewhat in contrast to what Nebuchadnezzar says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says to them, "See that fiery furnace over there? I'm going to cast you in it. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" So Darius is not saying that quite. He's actually saying, "Oh, Daniel, I hope your God will, in fact, deliver you." So it's interesting that the king seals the lion's den. And one thing that you may not have picked up, and it's a little small detail, has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. But in Matthew's account, Matthew makes note of the fact that the tomb of Jesus was actually sealed as well. That's in Matthew 27. So that the chief priests, they go to Pilate and they say, "Well, Jesus, we remember him saying he would rise on the third day, and we don't want anything strange going on, so can we have a guard?" And Pilate gives a guard to the chief priests. So the guard comes to the tomb, and it says that they seal the tomb. Now, that doesn't happen immediately when Jesus is buried and put in the tomb. So that's something the women don't know. When they go to the tomb on Easter Sunday morning, they don't really know that there's a Roman little detachment there. And they also don't know that the tomb has been sealed. So if the tomb is sealed, would the soldiers have been likely to just roll the stone away? And They probably said to the women, I'm sorry, this is sealed. You're not getting in here. Nobody's getting in here. But of course, the stone is rolled away by the angel, and that turns out not to be a problem. So the king is very anxious. And again, it's a very positive portrayal of Darius, the Persian king. Well, so the dawn comes. The king is anxious and awake all night. And the king's anxiety is captured in three phrases. It says, at the break of day, he went in haste, and he cried out at the opening of the tomb in anguish. And he says, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Well, so here's the good news. Daniel, in fact, is alive. He says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. So Daniel says, O king, God has protected me. He sent his angel, and he closed the mouths of the lions. Now we might wonder what that night was like for Daniel. If we'd have been in that situation, would that have been a comfortable night? I might have wanted to say to the angel, this is great if you just stay here through the night. If you don't go anywhere. And but at this point in the morning, the king is the one that is anxious, and Daniel is the one who is calm. So they bring Daniel out of the lion's den. There's no harm to him. His clothes are not torn. Everything's fine. And again, remember what happened when Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were brought out of the fiery furnace. Their clothes were not harmed. Their hair wasn't singed. There was no smell of smoke on their clothes. And the only thing different was that their bonds, their ropes that had bound them, had been burned off. So God has, in fact, saved Daniel, and it says that the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel should be brought and cast into the den of lions themselves, and them, their children, and their wives. And to prove that, in fact, Daniel was saved by God, it says that before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Now, so we might find the king's response a little bit excessive, but this would be fairly typical for something in that time. Part of your punishment was that you're not only punished, but your entire family is punished as well. So it turns out to work certainly in Daniel's favor. And it says at the end that he is promoted, but it also works in the king's favor, because he gets a chance to purge some of the corruption from his realm. So here's a group of corrupt administrators, and he is able to purge them from his kingdom, and we would imagine that the governance of his kingdom is going to run a lot more smoothly and be a lot more honest. Number one, with Daniel in charge and without all of these corrupt bureaucrats. Well, so the final part of this chapter is a decree by King Darius, who writes to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth. And certainly that really means within his realm. And he says, he makes a decree that people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. So he couldn't overturn the other edict, but now he is in a sense overturning it by issuing a new edict. And then he has just a remarkable statement in that edict. So why should people tremble before the God of Daniel? And he says, and in many of the Bibles this is put in a kind of poetic form, says, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He rescues and delivers. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, and he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So A very interesting statement. If we look at this statement, here's a statement that describes some of the attributes of God. He lives, he endures forever, he delivers and rescues, he works signs and wonders. His kingdom shall not be destroyed, his dominion shall never end. And if you think about that in terms of the Old Testament picture of God, that's a very orthodox statement about God. He's exactly right. That's a statement that is exactly in line with what the Old Testament says about God and his kingdom. So as we think about this story, one of the things we see is that there is a humiliation and tribulation of Daniel, but he comes through it and is exalted in the end. And so that's something that we see certainly in the story of Christ. In Philippians chapter 2 talks about his humiliation, his coming to earth to be human, but his ultimate exaltation. And some have asked, is this a paradigm of Christ? Is this a paradigm of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the danger of the lion's den, but the resurrection, the coming to new life out of that? And so it's a good question. In many ways, a lot of stories in the Old Testament are sort of precursors to the New Testament. Some have asked the question, is Darius, does he end up being a convert to Judaism here? Well, not technically. He doesn't. We don't have any sense that he starts doing all the Jewish ceremonies. But his statement of faith is certainly very orthodox. And Daniel's prayer to him is, O king, live forever, when he is addressing him out of the lion's den. So we might ask, is that a prayer that God answers? Is this saving faith for Darius? Is it true faith in the living God? And we don't know the answer to that question, but it's intriguing. Maybe we'll see Darius in heaven. Well, so here's a challenge to Daniel's faith right at the very end of his life. And we might think in the end of our life, we just kind of fade out. We kind of have an easy ending. We fight all our battles of faith early in our life. But here's an instance in which Daniel has to fight one. He has to hold fast to his faith even right up to the very end. And we should expect to have to do that as well, to hold fast to our faith right to the very end. Well, interestingly, this was a book that was in the Bible that was loved by a non-Christian world leader. If you think about who might that have been, well, it turns out it was Gandhi. Gandhi loved the book of Daniel because he saw in it a pattern for non-violent resistance against unjust laws. And he thought Daniel was the perfect example of how to resist laws that were unjust. You did that, you did so non-violently, but you recognize that you might pay the price for that as well. But Gandhi thought that the end result would always be what was right and just and good. So wonderful story. And again, Daniel is a story about someone of faith who holds to that faith even when it is difficult. And that's a good pattern for us and a good reminder to us that that is what we are to do and what we must do as followers of Christ. Well, so let me pray with us and pray us out. Gracious Father, thank you for this wonderful story. Thank you for the example of Daniel, and we pray that as we go through our week ahead and our various responsibilities, that you will help us hold fast to our faith and be faithful in all that we do, as was Daniel. Hear these prayers. We pray them in Christ's name. Amen.